Okay, I've just done some clerical work, um, which is actually looks like I might have found finally the missing link to starting to integrate some of the systems within my psychological research. This is quite embarrassing, and I'm going to sound like a quack trying to sort of separate these fields. But there's a tremendous amount of detail in my research which I can't even get into because it's so secluded and gated by a series of very specialized maneuverings and and things that I'm tracking, which you know would be wonderful to work out how to introduce those things from the ground up, um, which I'm not really capable of doing. The last piece of the puzzle of my research is the pure metaphysical interpretation, um, which is not finished, which is problematic. So it's hidden within all the mechanics that I've discovered, but those mechanics are involve so much and sort of rely on so many things that I've already started to kind of try to relay. Um, but those subjects are so complicated that, and they involve so many things happening simultaneously on so many different levels that it's really hard to work out how to systematize those issues. Um, and they already have been systematized under other subheadings, which my research has already finished dealing with. But the pure metaphysical reduction of them uh, is unfinished. Okay, so now I'm just repeating myself, but um, so in terms of looking at each individual cognitive function and working out what's going on, that's where I'm basically a bit lost. I'm not really capable of doing that. I mean, I can do it to some extent, but I sound like a crazy person, like a crackpot. And it's somewhat speculative and it's open to endless amounts of elaboration and such. At the level at which, because you see my field. Okay, I should have started by saying this. So, like my research, I generally there are two spheres of research which are completely separate camps. The one I call metagram, and the other one I call metatype, and they both involve each other directly. So I know, like everything that I deal with will have a translation of the other. And it's metatype that is unfinished. Metagram is basically done, but in some sense, metagram will not be entirely finished until metatype sort of completely confirms it and backs everything up and has a second explanatory narrative attached to it. And so the reason why I developed two separate fields that covered the same ground is so that I could when devising the system, I could use the one to check on the other. Um, and then the detail of metagram, which was always the metagram really does have all the very detailed components, but then I don't have the full understanding of those components in terms of metatype. But I know how they are constructed, but they were things that were discovered. They were not things that were posited. And metatype only comprises of things that are posited and defined. And so it'll only be properly done when metatype is fully laid out. now I have this fundamental problem because I've got these what I call emotional tones in metagram, and I don't know where they come from in terms of metatype. I did have a description of their I have descriptions of their composition. The composition of emotional tones are are cognitive functions inflected are inflections of cognitive function. Uh, and I know because of the various species of those compositions, I know that there are choruses of certain cognitive functions um, that are sort of grouped together, and I've even found correlations between this and religious writings, primarily the Hindu understanding of the guna, um, the well, the well the at least the psychic nature of karma, the what they call material energies, the sattva, raja, and tamas. Um, and rajas or rajasic, the rajas guna has I don't know if I should talk about, but depending on the subset of false ego that a particular individual has, um, they will be constrained between the emotional tones that are uh, hmm. So I don't know if I want to get into all of these tangents. They are interesting, and they reveal something about the metaphysical constraints of how the consciousness works. Because what is actually interesting is that um, to use a biological metaphor, different people are using different organs to do the same task. Um, and so, in some sense, people are almost fundamentally different creatures from that perspective, depending on their uh, the nature of their false ego, um, which is itself quite interesting. And so, what else is interesting is that now this is slightly confusing, but basically the most detailed description that I have of the false ego I call metagram. So I have described 48 metagram types in my system. Now each of those 48 types have 17 metatypes. Now metatype also contains a lot more information, which, as I've said, is not finished. But those metatypes are fixed. So each metagram type has a fixed metatype, and there are much fewer metatypes. There are only 17 metatypes. Although, based on some other pertinent information that you could garner from metagram, you could also say that there would be there'll be other subsets within those 17. So there would also be more species of metatype. In fact, there would probably be enough distinctive features from metagram that you could translate 48 distinct metatypes, but so maybe my terminology or jargon will eventually be revised. But basically speaking, there are, at least in theory, at least, although this is not actually the case, because, for example, as I said, that uh, there are three gunas. So in some sense, they are, it, on some hypothetical, there are, within the 17 meta types, there would at least hypothetically or potentially be three um, subspecies for each metatype, but some metatypes, uh, there just aren't all three. Sometimes there are duplicates, like there are two rajas meta number, that meta number. So of that meta type, there's one tamas and two rajas, and another one has one of each. It's and this has to do partly because of the asymmetries within the emotional tones themselves. So within each guna, there are 8 emotional tones, which I could have labeled differently. Um, I think I've labeled them correctly, but and there there is an asymmetry between those 8 things. They don't all sort of inhabit an equal space where sort of they all have a weird relationship with the other one that is uniform. They each actually have a kind of fixed position in a constellation, which is somewhat weird. And there is that pattern is the same for each guna. But obviously, the labels that comprise that constellation are different. And those labels, as I said earlier, are inflected cognitive functions which relate to the structures that I was already sort of getting into describing. Now, the point of me going through all of this, or is that the source material is itself, kind of weird, in that you have these 17 cognitive functions, of which there are only really 12 cognitive functions, because 5 of them aren't actually cognitive functions, although they can take on some. I can describe them or explain them slightly um, as kind of pseudo cognitive functions, but they cannot be used as sort of as objects of cognition, because they have to do almost with the conscious space itself, or they are the medium of consciousness itself. They are the inner gaze. It is the awareness itself. It is the vision of, and the tone. Uh, the light that fills the field of awareness, the hue of that light, the volume of that light, and such. Uh, so what else should I say now? So I've got a very interesting diagram now. So I've written out in a row 1 to 17, and then I've written out the cognitive functions above each number, and the weird ones I've just put in brackets because they don't really count, the ones that have to do with the sense of self. Um, and then I've just correlated it to, what is generally regarded as the axis. So the various axes are, for example, FITE or FIFE. And so if the introverted function is before the extroverted function, I've just sort of connected them up with a kind of straight line. Like, like a jumper cable, I've just drawn that. And then if it's going the opposite way, if the extroverted function is before the introverted function, I've sort of made it a squiggly line. And so you can see that there are some duplicates, because there are some functions just appear more than once. For example, there are 4 functions have duplicates. There are 2 SIs, there are 2 FIs, there are 2 SEs. 4 functions are duplicates, and therefore 4 functions don't have duplicates. Let me just quickly make a note of that. The 4 functions that don't have duplicates are, let me go, and I was thinking of writing them out when I was looking at these correlations. I also thought it would be interesting to point out which ones, well, the one, to just look for general patterns, I guess. Anyway, let me not name everything. So TE, TI, NE doesn't have a duplicate. What's the last one? I think the last one is an extroverted function. FE. So the somewhat interesting, because then the functions that have duplicates are by far in the majority introverted, and the functions that don't have duplicates are by far the ones that are extroverted. So the only function that doesn't have a duplicate that's introverted is TI, and the only function that doesn't have the only function that does have a duplicate that is extroverted is SE. Yeah, so I mean, there are all these sorts of, this is what gives it its almost, this is also what gives life its mysterious character, is these sorts of asymmetries. But anyway, and then drawing on top of it, yeah, I did think that this was very interesting. So there are things that just make some things more important than others, and I've already had just my I can never say this word nicely, how familiar I am with this. I mean, I've been thinking about this for most of my life now. For over 80% of my life, I've been meditating on this. So, I mean, there aren't many new ways for me to think about this stuff. So, I've, yeah. Anyway, so one of the interesting things, right, is, so when things are already in the right order, from an ontological perspective, you could say that I would say that they generally have a tendency to not be fucked up. They have a tendency to not be pathological. In fact, it's almost like a free gift at that point, that at least metaphysically one would expect to be a more available consensus as to that being the proper functioning and how systems should generally be ordered and maintained. So basically, when that kind of stuff gets fucked up, it generally, I think, it looks offensive, it looks dysfunctional. Um, and so some of these things are SI before SE, although that's quite sophisticated because it's quite high up. In fact, that's the highest thing, the SI translating to SE. So actually, it's very unlikely that people would actually be capable of that, because there's so many errors which would undermine that, because that sort of happens right at the end. The most basic one is FITE, which is actually already probably asking for too much. Actually, not so. Actually, I spoke too soon. That FITE is probably sort of the best the secular world is ever able to do. TE, I'm going to start using jargon now, although it's somewhat poetical and metaphorical. TE is actually technically firmly one step in heaven. You're already in a heavenly sphere with TE. I should probably talk about TI before talking about TE, but I do think that, in some sense, this is what I imagine Japan is sort of obsessed with on some level, from a cultural perspective. The FITE concordance, to call it that. But a very interesting correlation, somewhat related to that, is TITE. And TITE is TI being the 9th dimension and TE being the 10th dimension. That axis is very interesting because of another axis which goes the wrong way, which is between that TI and FE being the 1st dimension. And I understand that everything that I'm saying is very hard to follow and it just sounds confusing. You probably have to sketch this out. Maybe I'll just talk through that very slowly, so you might be able to write this out if you so wish. Okay, so and then I'll get onto the continuing right along with what I was talking about. So if you just write, I actually wrote from right to left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And then I'm just going to read out all the cognitive functions, and then at the end I'll just comment which ones should be in brackets so that you don't actually include them when you make these conduit connections between them. So 1 is FE, 2 is FI, 3 is TI, that should be in brackets, 4 is SI, 5 is NE, 6 is FI again, 7 is FE, which should be in brackets, 8 is SE, 9 is TI, 10 is TE, 11 is NE, that should be in brackets, 12 is NI, 13 is NI, 14 is TI, that should be in brackets, 15 is SI, 16 is FE, that should be in brackets, and 17 is SE. I mentioned the brackets as I was doing them, so basically just ignore the cognitive functions in brackets. So the other axes, okay, so 9 and 10, obviously they TI to TE is going in the right order, but now TI and FE are also on an axis, and they're both, there's no duplicate of that, right? Now Now, I understand that what I'm saying is still very esoteric, so let me just put some words into what this actually means. So, one of my definitions of TI, I'm going to start giving, I'm not going to give the technical definitions, I'm going to give the sort of the human definitions, even though they are not going to be necessarily that much easier than the purely dry philosophical ones. So, my definition of FE is what will be, and that is in inverted commas, that is in the frame of a preposition. So, so in the form, that's what when I say in prepositional form, or when I say in inverted commas, what I'm trying to, it is, subtext is the wrong word, but it's like thought in the form of what will be is FE. That is sort of my human definition of what will, of extroverted feeling. So extroverted feeling is thought in the form of, in inverted commas, what will be. So if thought accords to that formula, that form of thought, is it a what will be? Now, what is basically an image, and will be is, yeah. Actually, this would actually be better if I also added my other definition. And I'm also going to give my slogan labels to these things as well, so they'll be interesting. So, what will be, or FE, extroverted thinking. My one word for this would be instinct, and my my definition of this, in the this might be hard to follow. Determination of expression, in brackets, any presentation, by realizing the potential of situation, in brackets, any substance. So that's my definition of extroverted feeling. Determination of expression, which means any presentation, the presentation of, by realizing the potential of situation, any substance. So that's a more wordy way of just saying what will be. So obviously the what will be, you have to be tracking somewhat that is going to, will be something. So there is a what, and then there is what that what will be. And that's really all that dry definition is somewhat describing. I do think that my definitions, although they might be dry and confusing, between them they actually render a much clearer image, and philosophical, conceptual treatment of these issues. And if they are properly tracked, they will actually resolve a lot of philosophical problems. They will avoid a lot of issues, and Sorry, this is a bit annoying. Uh, it, it's not the best thing to talk about something that is somewhat unrelated. But essentially, TI has its hands in a lot of different jars that come before it. This would be easier if I went into the sixth dimension, because especially the dynamism represented by the sixth dimension is, which is also called the salt. It creates the template of a vibrancy, which kind of, it sets up a medium for life itself that confines it into channels of possibility. And the subsequent sort of set of conditions that yeah, I'm not really doing justice to this. This really sets into the focus the work that well, this can be embarrassing if I get his first name wrong, but I think it's John. Oh wait, I'm going to get his surname wrong as well. John Vervaeke. Oh my word, that's embarrassing if I get his name wrong. The Canadian psychology professor who focuses a lot on salience. The sort of the flow of that salience and the sort of the immediacy of that and the sort of the politics of that. Reaches a kind of contemplative schema that doesn't have to be read, it doesn't have to be understood, it doesn't have to be interpolated. But if one does the work of interpolating the flow of that salience and somewhat structuring it, the the real thing that you have to posit in order to enter into that realm is a character feature um, that you really do have to postulate into being. And this really is the primordial soup that heaven is structured out of, which is a sense of endurance. And this is really the engine of TI, is that if you can conceive of a an element, the elemental feature, or um, this this character property, um, or abstract property of endurance, which is, somewhat. So if you can give your abstract contemplative model of what you consider salient, if you can imbue that with the character of endurance, then you have TI, to the extent to which there is an endurance substance. So to the extent to which you have the material of endurance, um, you have the starting I keep on using the word material, but yeah, TI is made up of the notion of endurance on that abstract level. And that's not the full thing. It isn't. It comes from endurance. I mean, once you have the endurance, you pretty much have to smash it and reorder it. Um, it is fundamentally problematic in some sense, because it doesn't ever get you very far. Endurance in its pure sense, right? This would be a description of um, I can't think of the word, but immature, a kind of immature thinking faculty. Thought itself is a very strange beast, and within it is packed the myriad of all the defects and problems. Sort of. You have to feed it everything at some point. You have to let it envelop everything. You have to let it swallow the world as well. It has to sort of completely traverse everything, so everything sort of gets adopted by it. Um, but uh, just because you let it do that doesn't mean that it actually has mastery over all those things that it has translated into itself. And that should hopefully come from its own engine that it has sort of replicated of the things that you have allowed it to encapsulate. uh, and so it has a kind of, within itself, it has a wardened off area in which there is uh, the thinking model of, the best way to call it would be humility. Um, and so, what it leaves uninscribed within itself is very important. And this is, I think, generally all the injunctions that have to do with not having a graven image of God. This is really where they come into effect. And in some sense, the connection with God really is focused on, in some sense, the spiritual identity of the adherent, um, which does have a conception of itself. Uh, and this is quite a haughty facility in some sense, and this is what the notion of the role of the apostle is, and so it's capable of sort of dividing up uh, and constraining itself to the extent to which it is actually capable of having what can only be described as a real hope. It's not. It's not. That is how its contemplative structure is able to. It doesn't know the future, uh, but it knows that it has hope about. Well, I mean, in some sense, I would say it's almost atheistic as to there being a future. I mean, the sort of the indirect concept of the future. This is somewhat, it's a stupid sort of paradox to try to unravel. So in some sense, the future is only a device of speech, but in some sense, the continuing present, the unfolding present, that is what you have hope in. So when I said the future initially, that's the process of the unfolding present, which one has an active hand or lever within, in some sense, that manifesting as a collateral trust. And so, I don't know if this is worth sort of, but so the hope itself, to the extent to which it doesn't have a pervasive vision, is holding a cane, and that cane is something like the trust that it has, or a staff rather than a cane. Let me think. So in some sense, it has the trust rather than the ascended man has trust and hope rather than an infallible instinct. Uh, so it doesn't manifest as an infallible instinct. It's not the instinct that is infallible, it is uh, the trust which is capable of being malleable um, to an unfolded instinct. Within that unfolded instinct, there is a thread of hope and trust that is unbroken. Um, and so that reversed connection between the TI and the extroverted feeling is really an opportunity. Uh, it gets a bit too obtuse to get into. I mean, what I've just said slightly just before what I just said is the probably the best thing that one can say about this topic. Uh, what is more interesting to go into is the connection between FI and TE, because that is really much more vibrant and vigorous and interesting, and really connected to something real. And it also flows in the right direction, that the ontologically FI is prior to the TE. And so there's a real connection between those things. There's a real resonance between those things, and that resonance is in chorus with the TITE. So the somewhat the the discordance between the TIFE is something like well, if there wasn't a discordance there, you might as well just collapse the whole thing into into FE. You might as well just be a meat machine at that point, because why it will be will no longer have the prominent central um, uh, function and pillar of uh, and a kind of and the core collateral pillar of the discerning apparatus. It is also TI. The apostle is most closely connected with the gift of discerning, because why it will be, the alignment of why it will be, and it is a really tough thing, because it doesn't come from anywhere else but itself. Why is the first. It isn't actually the first why function, but it is the first why volitional function. Um, when I was giving the definitions of these, you see, this is why this is always a broader topic. The first why function is actually the fifth dimension, and also the sixth dimension is also another why function, if I'm remembering it correctly. No, wait, that's not true. It's only one of them, not the other one. it's only the sixth. The sixth is the Y function. 5 is actually a how. 5 is how it will be. 6 is why it should be, which is the salt, why it should be. And then 9 is why it will be. Let me just, since I've mentioned them by passing, I think I will just do the specific work of mentioning the names, the one-word names. So let me just also read out the other definitions. TI, the definition of TI is determining and applying a substantiation to a correlation. The definition of FI is applying one's own measure of worthiness or value. And the definition of TE is constructing and directing one's observation of apparent truth. NE is extrapolating the potential of perception, how it will be. SE is experiencing the present context and appraising its potential. I didn't actually go into that. And SI is referencing a perspective in relation to experience. And NI is grasping a substantiation through impression. Okay, I shouldn't have gone through all of those, but I just, in case anyone is making notes. What did I want to say? It is interesting. Some of these things do come out a bit clearer when you add the words perceiving and judging. Or perhaps they come out more clearly. Hope, judging why things will be. Instinct, judging what things will be like. NE, prudence, perceiving how things will be. Trust, TE, judging what would be true, or judging what should be. I think I found that semantically it was sort of equivalent to say what should be or what would be true. That, anyway. This is actually an older some of my older permutations of some of these things are use different elaborations, and then I ended up trying to find things that were uniform and such. And anyway, what was the point that I wanted to make? I wanted to read out the one word: trust, hope, instinct, prudence. What did I call the salt, which would be FI, was eminence. Oh yes, the salt is eminence. Judging why things would be right, I've got here, but yeah, judging why things should be. Yeah, so it seems that when I add the word true or right as a qualification, then it stops being in the subjective first person and starts being as a talking about yourself as an object in the third person. So judging why things would be right is something that you would say about somebody else's cognition. Oh, they are judging why things would be right. In their first person perspective, they would say, I'm judging why this should be the case. Um, yeah, I hope I'm showing that distinction, although you can see it gets semantically problematic, especially when it only gets problematic because if I, for example, use that, where in this, let's see, in this table, I've got, then I'm using should for the other ones. So in this table, which is an old one, moderation is defined as what things should be like. Again, before I said, oh, my definition of moderation is what would be. And again, to put it in the form of what things should be like, that is like a third person. I'm running out of battery on my phone, so I better let me think. Okay, so now I've gone through a lot of this stuff. Talking about TI. Oh, yeah, so I was just trying to get into the core issue of talking about why it will be being such a pivotal, that's a good word I think for it, is pivotal feature of cognition. And it really does have to do with rooting oneself in a sense of being, of attunement. It is a condition of attunement, and it is a condition of sort of deliberation, but that level of deliberation of why it will be is not in an immediate computational sense. It is more about identifying with a kind of a system of deliberation. It doesn't, like TI is generally conceived of, or at least how I generally conceive of it, as a matrix. It is, allowing oneself to be plugged into a deliberate matrix of one's own construction, but that it doesn't, it's not. The style of matrix that it allows itself to conform with. So in some sense, it is a self-imposed conformity, or at least a sense of bounded in some sense, I guess you could perhaps make an argument that hope, taking along these descriptions and explanations, hope is something of a contract that one is willing to make with one's own intellect, in terms of the powers and capacities that one is agreeing to permit and restrain, to question and know. It is a somewhat of a metaphysical contract and constitution in that sense. So it is a way of sort of conducting one's. This is too much of a metaphor, but one's business. And so, I mean, in some sense, it's not the contract, but it's the signature, perhaps. um, it's sort of recognizing recognizing one's own ascent and sort of continually affirming that is really why it will be comes down to it's sort of like a positive ascent. So it's an ongoing gift of ascent that one is participating, and that is another way of saying that is that it is a living hope. In that sense, it is the life of having real hope, the life bounded by the character of that hope. And then, what else to say about it? So hope, in essence, it is the starting point of putting things in motion, but it is itself not actually. It doesn't have that many moving parts. It's sort of like the true north. Sort of aspect, but it doesn't sort of. It is the starting point to give one reference as to how to sort of conduct one's business, or it is the sort of the groundwork and such. But it doesn't sort of deliver it's sort of it does imply a great deal. Having a working face and head implies that it's probably not dismembered, that it probably is connected to an agile or competent living body, but it does actually have other appendages and organs and such. And so the health of literally the face and the head does imply something about the body, but it does it's not a substitute for an actual it's just a piece of it's a very important piece, but it's not uh, uh, it can't substitute for the whole body. And so the countenance of hope is by no means the delivery mechanism, but it is the source of humanity in some sense. The full constitution of a living countenance of hope. Okay, so I think that's all I can really. I don't think I can say really anything more. I probably would have found more things to say if there was more battery life. It's probably long enough.